What would you say if a cop walked up to you right now and demanded your ID? One wrong answer can turn a simple stop into a detention, a search, or an arrest. One calm sentence can force the whole moment into the open. Hit subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you could save you from giving away rights you didn't even know you had. Like this video too, because under stress you need simple words you can actually remember. Here's what you're about to learn. The one question that tells you whether this is a real detention or just fishing. The simple phrase to use when an officer demands ID and you're not sure you legally have to give it. The huge difference between walking down the street and sitting behind the wheel. And the follow-up line that stops you from talking yourself into trouble. Most people have no idea how fast a casual police contact can turn serious. 1 minute feels friendly. The next minute you're being told to sit down, keep your hands visible, and answer more questions. Let me show you exactly how to slow that whole thing down and make the law do the work for you, not your panic. Now let's talk about why this matters so much. A lot of people think police can demand ID from anyone at any time. That's not true. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. And the whole outcome depends on one thing. Are you in a voluntary conversation or are you being lawfully detained? If you mix those up, you can either give up rights you had or argue at the worst possible moment. Here's the reality. You do not win these moments by acting tough. You win by staying calm, using short words, and making the officer state the legal reason out loud. That matters in the street, it matters on body cam, and it matters later in court if the stop gets challenged. The first thing you need to do is find out what kind of encounter this is before you argue, before you explain, before you reach for anything. You look at the officer and say this: "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" Those exact words. Memorize them. Why does this work? Because it forces the moment into one of two lanes. If the officer says you're free to go, then you leave calmly. You do not stick around and keep chatting. If the officer says you're being detained, now the law matters, and now the officer has to be able to justify holding you there. This comes straight from Supreme Court rulings. Brown versus Texas said police cannot just stop somebody and demand identification with no real reason. In plain English, that case means an officer needs actual facts that make you reasonably look connected to crime, not just a vague feeling, not just the neighborhood, and not just because you looked nervous. Here's why this question is so powerful. When you ask if you're detained, you stop guessing. You stop volunteering information. You stop helping the officer build a case against you. Defense attorneys use this exact line in court because it draws a bright line. Either this is casual or it's not. Either you're free or you're not. That matters more than most people realize. Watch what happens when you skip this step. The officer says, "Hey, come here a second. Let me see your ID." You answer with a nervous laugh. You start explaining where you're going. You say you have nothing to hide. Now the officer has more words from you, more details, more chances to spot what they call inconsistency. That's how small talk becomes suspicion. Now watch what happens when you do it right. The officer says, "Let me see your ID." You stay calm. You keep your hands visible. You say, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If the answer is free to go, the encounter is over unless you choose to keep talking. If the answer is detained, now you know this is not casual anymore, and you move to the next step. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Why are you messing with me? I didn't do anything." Then the stop gets emotional, longer, and harder to control. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" Then the officer has to define the stop right away. That one question protects you because it keeps you from wandering into a trap. It is calm. It is respectful. And yes, this is 100% legal. Have you ever had an officer ask for ID when you weren't driving? Tell me in the comments because I want to know how many of you have been put in this exact spot. Now here comes the phrase from the title. If the officer says you are detained and then demands ID, your next line is simple. "Officer, am I legally required to identify myself in this state?" Word for word. That is the phrase. Burn it into your memory. Here's the trick they don't want you knowing. The rules are different depending on where you are and what kind of stop this is. In some states, during a lawful stop, police can require you to identify yourself. In other places, they cannot. And even where they can, that often means stating your name, not automatically handing over a physical card. That point matters a lot. Hiibel versus Sixth Judicial District Court is the key case here. In plain English, the Supreme Court said that during a lawful investigative stop, a state can require you to state your name if that state has a stop and identify law. But the case also made clear that this did not automatically mean you had to produce a driver's license or physical ID card in every non-driving encounter. So your job is not to guess. Your job is to ask the clean question. "Officer, am I legally required to identify myself in this state?" If the officer says no, then you know you just protected your rights without picking a fight. If the officer says yes and you are on foot in a lawful stop and identify situation, then you may need to give your name. not your life story. Not where you were just coming from, not where you're headed, not who you were with. Just the identifying information the law actually requires. Here's the reality. People get into trouble because they jump from ID into a full interview. They think if they sound helpful, they'll go home faster. Usually the opposite happens. The more you talk, the more doors you open. That's why your words must stay tight and boring. Legal experts agree this is your strongest protection. You are not refusing in a rude way. You are asking for the legal basis. That is smart. That is calm. That is exactly how you avoid giving up more than the law requires. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Fine, here, take it. I've got nothing to hide." Then the officer learns you'll comply with extra requests without making them explain anything. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, am I legally required to identify myself in this state?" Then the officer has to rely on the actual law, not pressure. There's another big reason this line works. It sounds respectful. Officers hear fewer challenge words. You are not saying, "You have no right." You are not saying, "I know the law better than you." You are asking a direct legal question in a calm voice. Former police officers have confirmed this works because it lowers tension while still protecting you. And let me be clear about one thing. Never lie. Never hand over fake documents. Never physically resist. If you're in a place where the law really does require your name during a lawful detention, give the required identifying information and stop there. That is how you stay safe and preserve the issue for later. Listen closely because this is critical. Everything changes if you are driving. If you are behind the wheel and an officer lawfully stops your car, you usually do have to provide your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance when asked. So do not use the street encounter script like you're standing on a sidewalk if you are actually in the driver's seat. Here's exactly what you say. "Officer, I will provide my license, registration, and proof of insurance." Short, calm, clean. That line helps because it shows you know the difference between a legal duty and a fishing expedition. If you're driving, handle the required documents. Do not turn a simple document request into an argument. Delaware versus Prouse tells us something important here. In plain English, the Supreme Court said police cannot just randomly stop cars to check licenses with no valid reason. But once a lawful traffic stop happens, the officer can ask for the driving documents tied to that stop. So your move is simple. Comply with the document request. Do not volunteer extra facts. This is where a lot of drivers mess up. The officer asks for license and registration. The driver starts explaining where he was, what he drank, why he looks tired, why his friend was nervous, and why the bag in the back seat is not a big deal. None of that helps you. The law requires documents, not a running monologue. Defense attorneys use this exact line in court because it shows you are cooperative with legal commands but not careless with your mouth. That is a huge difference. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Sure, officer, no problem. I'm coming from my cousin's house and we were only there for an hour and I had one beer, but I'm fine." Then extra details create extra suspicion. Good way. Smart drivers say, "Officer, I will provide my license, registration, and proof of insurance." Then the officer gets the required documents and nothing extra. If the officer keeps digging, remember this. The mission of a traffic stop is limited. The officer can handle the reason for the stop, check your license, run records, and deal with safety issues. But that does not give them a free pass to turn every stop into a random investigation. This comes straight from Supreme Court rulings. And if you know that, you stop feeding the stop with your own words. If you're still here, you're already ahead of almost everybody on the road. Show me that by hitting like and drop a comment saying "I'm still here," because the next part is where people save themselves from the biggest mistake of all. After you deal with the ID issue, you need to lock down the rest of the conversation. Here's exactly what you say next. "I choose to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." Those exact words. Memorize that line too. This is powerful because it closes two giant doors at once. First, it stops you from talking your way into trouble. Second, it makes your position clear if the officer later tries to say you agreed to a search. A lot of people think silence makes them look guilty. That is not how the law works. Talking gives the officer material. Silence takes that material away. Rodriguez versus United States is the big case here. In plain English, the Supreme Court said police cannot extend a completed traffic stop just to investigate something unrelated unless they have proper legal reason. That means once the normal mission of the stop is done, they cannot keep you there just to go fishing without enough legal support. Your silence helps because it gives them less to build on. Your refusal to consent helps because it preserves your rights if they search anyway. Watch what happens when someone forgets this step. The officer gets the ID question settled. Then he says, "You mind if I take a look?" The driver laughs and says, "I guess that's fine. I've got nothing in there." Now the search becomes consent. That one sentence can wipe out arguments that would have helped later. Now watch the better version. The officer says, "You mind if I ask you a few more questions?" You answer, "I choose to remain silent." The officer says, "You mind if I check the car?" You answer, "I do not consent to any searches." That is clean, that is respectful, and this is 100% legal. Bad way. Most drivers say, "Go ahead, I've got nothing to hide." Then the search starts because you opened the door yourself. Good way. Smart drivers say, "I choose to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." Then the officer has to rely on actual legal authority, not your permission. Legal experts agree this is your strongest protection because it keeps the encounter inside legal limits. You are not resisting. You are not yelling. You are not making sudden moves. You are simply refusing to help build a case against yourself. Let's pull the law together in simple English. Brown versus Texas says police cannot stop you and demand identification with no real reason. That protects you from random, arbitrary police interference. Hiibel says that if you are lawfully detained in a state with a stop and identify law, you may have to state your name. That does not automatically mean a full interview. And it does not automatically mean handing over a physical ID card when you are not driving. Delaware versus Prouse says police cannot randomly stop cars just to check documents with no reason. And Rodriguez says police cannot drag out a traffic stop beyond its normal job just to go on a fishing trip without legal support. That is the framework. Ask if you're detained. Ask if the law requires identification. If driving, provide the required documents, then shut down extra questions and refuse consent to searches. Now let's walk through one real scenario so you can hear exactly how this sounds in real life. You're walking home at night, a patrol car stops, an officer steps out and says, "Hey, come here, let me see your ID." The wrong way starts instantly. You get defensive. You say, "Why? I know my rights. You can't stop me." Then you keep talking. You explain where you were. You explain why you're in the area. You explain why you look nervous. Now the whole thing is heated, messy, and full of words the officer can twist. Now here's the right way. You stop moving. Hands visible. Calm voice. You say, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" If the officer says you're free to go, you leave calmly. End of encounter. If the officer says you are being detained, you move to the next line. "Officer, am I legally required to identify myself in this state?" If the answer is yes, and the law actually requires your name in that situation, you give the identifying information required and nothing else. Then you say, "I choose to remain silent." If the officer asks to search your bag, you say, "I do not consent to any searches." Now let's switch to a traffic stop. Same principle, different first move. You get pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer asks for license, registration, and proof of insurance. You do not argue. You say, "Officer, I will provide my license, registration, and proof of insurance." You hand over only what is required. The officer asks where you're coming from. You say, "I choose to remain silent." The officer asks if there's anything illegal in the car. Same answer. The officer asks to search. You say, "I do not consent to any searches." That sequence is clean. It is calm. It protects you at every step. Let me show you exactly why this works. Every line does one job. The first line defines the stop. The second line checks the legal duty. The third line handles required driving documents if you're in a car. The fourth line shuts down fishing and protects you from consent. Short words, clear lanes, no extra talking. Next week, I'm dropping the video on what to say when cops claim they smell weed. Subscribe right now because that one is where people give away their whole case in 10 seconds flat. So here's the quick recap. First, ask, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That tells you whether this is casual or legal. Second, if they demand ID and you're not driving, ask, "Officer, am I legally required to identify myself in this state?" That forces the officer to rely on actual law. Third, if you are driving, provide your license, registration, and proof of insurance without volunteering anything else. Fourth, close your mouth and protect your space by saying, "I choose to remain silent and I do not consent to any searches." That is the play. Simple, calm, repeatable. Hit subscribe so you don't miss that next video on the smell of weed trick. Smash like if this just gave you words you can actually use under pressure, and drop a comment telling me which line you're going to memorize first. Stay safe out there.